everyone. Welcome back. I'm Cole Phillips, author of The Adventure of the Twisted Truths and host of The Book and Dagger. And today we're going to be continuing our discussion on the Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis. Now, I've already done two Space Trilogy videos. One was just kind of an overview as like a whole of the series. And then I did another video that was a deeper dive into the first book of the series, Out of the Silent Planet. And today we're going to be talking about the second book in the Space Trilogy series. And that book is called Perelandra. So in Out of the Silent Planet, we follow the adventures of Dr. Elwin Ransom, who got kidnapped and taken to Mars, or Malacandra as it's called. And he met this being called the Oyarsa and the Eldils, who are basically like these angels that guard the planets. He met sentient races living on Mars or Malacandra. And eventually he got back to Earth. Now, we're going to continue. In the second book, what happens is it's really cool because the first book ends with basically C.S. Lewis going into like first person and talking about, basically he puts himself in the story, which I think is really cool whenever authors do this. And he's like, basically he's saying that he's friends with Ransom. So the first book opens up where he gets a letter from Ransom asking him to come to his place. So C.S. Lewis goes to Ransom's place and basically learns basically Ransom tells him that he's been summoned by the Eldils to go to Perelandra, or Venus. And because apparently the Bent One, or the Oyarsa of Volcandra, which is Earth, the silent planet, basically Satan, he's got some kind of evil plan, and the Eldils want Ransom to go solve it. And so Ransom gets put in this coffin box, and the Eldils transport him to Venus. Now, basically, Ransom arrives on Venus, and he finds Venus is basically paradise. Venus is floating islands, and it's just the temperature is nice and warm and sunny. It's basically I guess you could say think Hawaii with the islands floating all around, and it's just this really beautiful place where all the creatures are living in peace. But Ransom finds that they're basically the creatures on Earth there. They aren't sentient like the creatures on Malacandra or Mars. And he doesn't see any humans, which doesn't surprise him. So he's journeying around, just trying to figure out what's going on Perelandra. But eventually he runs into this lady called the Green Woman, because she is green. But apparently, she's called the Green Woman, or the Queen, and basically she's the only human Ransom has met so far in this world. And she says that it's only herself and the king who live in Perelandra, which the king is the first man of Perelandra, and she's the first woman. So it's very similar to an Adam and Eve situation, where they're living. It's just two humans and a bunch of animals that are living in paradise. Now, basically, what happens though is Ransom begins to talk with this lady, and he finds out that she does not the people on Malacandra, the sentient races there. They were aware of sin and kind of the concept of sin and what it could do to people. On Perelandra, they're not aware of sin at all. They don't know what evil is. They don't know what death is. They're just basically literally Adam and Eve. They're just living in this paradise, and with no concept of evil or good, and just literally the Garden of Eden. Anyway, but so eventually, however, Ransom and the Green Lady have a bunch of chats of theological discussions and stuff. But then they see a spaceship come crashing into Perelandra. And so Ransom's like, oh no. But turns out it's Weston from the first book, the guy who kidnapped Ransom and flew to Mars because he wanted to exterminate all the creatures on Mars and make Mars a safe place for humans to come and just reproduce, so that the human race can live forever and ever and ever, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, so it's Weston, but he's different. He meets up with Ransom. They start talking, and Ransom realizes that Weston is he's acting different and weird. Eventually, what happens is Weston has been possessed by the the bent one of Thulcandra, and basically, so he's trying. But Weston comes to Perelandra, and he tries to get the Green Lady to basically do what the serpent did to Eve in the Garden of Eden. He is like telling her like there's these certain rules that have been set by Melendil, or God, as they he's known in the books. And Weston's like, oh well, you should just disobey these rules. And he's trying to like tempt her with all this stuff. And so Ransom is trying to like defend her, and it's really cool because it sets up all these like theological discussions. Like even if you're not a Christian, it's a really interesting scenario there because he's like Weston is presenting all these like philosophical and just like moral questions of like what's right and what's wrong, and Ransom is trying to refute them, and meanwhile the Green Lady is just sitting there like having no idea what's going on because she doesn't know what death is, like doesn't know what's like she has no idea what right and wrong is. So Ransom and Weston are sitting there trying to both get her on their side, and she's just like, okay, okay, yeah, yeah. Anyway, so eventually Ransom realizes that it is the bent one possessing Weston, or as they begin to call him in the books, the unman, because it starts to show Weston starts to like do all this creepy, like he starts, his face begins to be deformed, and he starts to like Ransom realizes it's the devil inside Weston. Eventually, this all leads to a massive fight between Weston and Ransom, like a physical just combat. And Ransom tries to kill the unman, and he gets wounded very severely, and the the bent one like bites him on the heel, which causes a unhealable wound in Ransom. And then Ransom manages, he picks up a rock and he crushes the unman's head, which, if you know anything about the Bible, it's very interesting because there is the I think it was a prophecy in like the Old Testament that said, I forget which one. One of the Old Testament prophets was like, "Oh, the woman shall bear a seed, and the serpent there will be enmity." I don't know. God said this to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. He was like, "The woman's seed shall have war between you and the woman's seed, and you'll crush his heel, and he'll crush your head." Which, of course, that being the conflict between Satan and Jesus, and Satan bruising the Satan bruising the seed's heel is when they crucify Jesus, and Jesus crushing the serpent's head is when uh, he overcame death and conquered sin. Um, but anyway, so that's a little interesting parallel there because it is C.S. Lewis did intend like Ransom is a very big like parallel of like Jesus and him fighting like Weston possessed by the devil is a big parallel of the contest between like Jesus and Satan. But anyway, so Ransom, their fight took them to these underwater like caves and stuff, and Ransom eventually like manages to crawl out of the caves. And when he comes out, he runs into the Oyarsa of Malacandra again, who has conveniently showed up on Perelandra after Weston was defeated. But anyway, the Oyarsa of Perelandra and the Oyarsa of Malacandra, or Mars and Venus, they are waiting there, and they welcome Ransom. They're like, "Oh yes, you are a tool, or you are like you are." They were like, "You were Melendil's tool in this, and you did a great job." And it's never really explained like why they couldn't fight the bent one, but I'm assuming it's just the same reason why angels don't just randomly pop into Earth and just you know stop a terrorist attack, whatever. I mean, there are like instances where God has sent angels to intervene in mankind, and it does still happen today. It's just extremely rare, and I'm not quite aware of why. It just like doesn't happen every time. But this is not a theological channel, and uh, anyway, we're just gonna move on with the books. And if you want to find out more about maybe why angels don't intervene, maybe read your Bible more. Maybe that should apply to me too. Because anyway, but what happens is Ransom meets uh, the Oyarsas. He meets Perelandra and Malacandra themselves, and they say they're going to officially like give Perelandra over to like the king and the queen, basically going to make the king the Oyarsa of Perelandra, and the humans give the humans rule over Malacandra because that's what Melendil wants. And so they take on these like as they go to ransom. They're like, because the Elendils are like the Elendils are creatures of like light, and like you can't really see them that much because they're like just faint little sparks of light here and there. But anyway, so ransom, they're like, hey, we want to be seen by the humans. So like they like a ransom, they're like, what form should we take? And they start to take all these different forms and take like these giant wheels of fire. And ransom's like, no, that's probably not a good idea. And then so they eventually just take on these like human like forms, but they're obviously Eldil still. And it's just a really interesting scene though, because Ransom looks at them and he's like sees these giant beautiful creatures, like beautiful terrible creatures, and he's like, it's an interesting scene in the books because he says as they say that Ransom says later in the books, my eyes have seen Mars and Venus, I have seen Ares and Aphrodite, which is interesting that he calls them by their Greek and Roman mythological god names. And it hints that, which is a theory that I've thought for a while, and I see that C.S. Lewis is kind of, at least my interpretation, that C.S. Lewis is kind of also backing this theory, is that the Greek and Roman mythologies, where they said that there were like gods and goddesses, came from when men saw angels, and like legends of that were passed down. And so eventually they'd return into, oh, it's the gods, and when in reality they were just guardian angels of the world. But it's really interesting because anyway, then Ransom and Malacandra and Perelandra, or Mars and Venus, however you want to call them, or Ares and Aphrodite, they go to this mountain, and all the like creatures, the beasts, are gathered, and the king and the queen, or the first man and woman, they come, and they like, there's a ceremony. The Oyarsa of Perelandra gives control. She's like, okay, here you have control. You're basically the Oyarsa of Perelandra now. Rule it well. And the king and the queen, they acknowledge Ransom, and they're like, basically like, you were sent here by Melendil to help us. We thank you, and we shall, our descendants shall praise and honor your name. And basically then what happens is Ransom gets sent back to Earth, but it's interesting because before he goes, he still has the wound in his heel that the unman gave him. And they're like, and the king and the queen notice this, and they're like, and the queen is like, will he die? Because it just won't stop bleeding. And the king says, no, I think a human who has breathed the air of these mountains and drunk from the waters of these mountains will not find it easy to die. Which is basically because Perelandra is paradise. Ransom goes back to Earth where his wound is still bleeding, so he'll have to keep it tightly wrapped and stuff. But he won't die because he's basically been to paradise. So this is really interesting because it sets up what happens in the third book, which basically, slight spoiler for the third book, is that Ransom is basically, ever since coming back from Perelandra, he doesn't age, and he won't catch sickness or die, which is really interesting. But that's basically what happens in the second book, and we'll be doing a deep dive into the third book, That Hideous Strength, soon. So I will catch you guys in that video. Have a good one.